Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the DTP Show. Thanks for joining us today. This is a production of the students of the SCI-Arc Design Theory and Pedagogy class of 2021. Today, we are hearing from students and their invited guests on topics both central and tangential to their research and pedagogies. Our next panel will discuss emergent economic conditions and how they shape the structures and architecture of contemporary life. This conversation will examine platform capitalism's role in shaping cities, along with how the public sphere is becoming a more and more privatized online space. Our invited guest today is Nick Cernicek. He's a lecturer in digital economy at King's College in London. With Helen Hester, he is currently writing a book on what anti-work politics and social reproduction theory can learn from each other. His most recent book, Platform Capitalism, sets out a framework for understanding the novelties of businesses like Google, Amazon, and Alibaba, as well as how digital platforms generate new tendencies within our economies. His current research is continuing this focus by examining the political economy of AI and looking how it will affect the power dynamics of contemporary capitalism. Seymour Politan is a curator and writer based in Los Angeles and a graduating student in the Design Theory and Pedagogy program here at SCI-Arc. His work focuses on decolonizing the exhibition space and utilizing exhibitions to construct public spaces by examining mobility and the reconstitution of non-places. He also works as a research assistant at SCI-Arc, leading the Perpetual Affordability Project, which focuses on community land trusts, a model for community ownership that has been gaining popularity in recent years. So I'll now hand it over to Seymour, who will get our conversation started. Thank you again for joining us.
Hi, so thanks so much, Nick, for joining us today. It's really exciting to have you here, particularly in the context of SCI-Arc, which I think is going to be really important for students in the community to hear your perspective and the work you've been doing. I wanted to begin with seeing if you could kind of define and say a little bit of the background of some of the work you've been doing and the terms that you've been using. So I was wondering if we could start with social reproduction, just so that everybody can kind of become familiar with what it is and how it's used, which we'll further address in the conversation.
Yeah, so social reproduction is one of the main topics of the book that I'm writing right now with Helen Hester. Social reproduction, it comes from originally Marxist theorists sort of thinking about typically the unwaged labor that goes into reproducing humans on a daily level. So, cooking, cleaning, that sort of basic stuff, but also generationally, how, childcare, elder care, gestational labors, things like this, how all of that forms sort of an unrecognized and unwaged foundation for the proper sort of productive capitalist economy as it was traditionally understood by Marxists. So if you want to think about what social reproduction is on a basic level, it's things like cooking, caring, cleaning, all of that sort of work, which at least when these debates started emerging really in the 1960s and 70s, it was largely seen as unwaged labor done in the home. But one of the things, and actually we'll talk about this in a bit, I think, with respect to the pandemic, a lot of this work is now actually moving into the market as well. So it's not just unwaged work anymore. It's now turning into the sort of the commodification of care. And I think there's a lot of interesting things going on there, and sort of some potential, crisis moments within the way in which we do social reproduction today.
Yeah, so I think that brings it into the contemporary context, which I'm actually really excited to be able to talk to you in during this time, because I think that it's been a dramatic change in the way that our society is thinking about social reproduction, our society is thinking about domestic labor. A lot of issues that you've been working on and speaking about for a number of years are really coming into public discourse, and I think in a very dramatic and shifting way. And I wanted to see if you could elaborate on how the pandemic has affected social reproduction, and I think keeping in mind that mostly middle and higher income workers have been able to stay at home, while lower income workers have been forced to still work in the place, essentially putting themselves in danger. And so I was wondering how has this uh, pushed this concept of social reproduction in our society?
Yeah, so I think there's, a couple of major changes. One is the complete sort of dissolution of this idea that reproduction takes place in the home and work takes place in a workplace. And this is sort of the traditional way in which like the production and reproduction of society was distinguished. It was a spatial distinction, what's done in the home and then what's done in the workplace. That I think has been completely sort of demolished by the pandemic with the rise of all this remote work, people working from home. That sort of spatial distinction doesn't hold. And, I think we need something to replace it with. And one of the things I find quite convincing is the work of EndNotes on this issue, particularly the work of Maya Gonzalez, who tries to think about the distinction between social reproduction and production in a more sort of, in terms of social relations rather than a sort of spatial distinction. So thinking about, for instance, to give a very simple example, the work of cleaning. So if I'm cleaning my own home, that's unwaged work, but it's not actually producing any sort of value for capitalism. Capitalism may benefit indirectly from it, but it's not, I'm not forced by a boss to clean my house any quicker or anything like that. Whereas if I hire a cleaner, suddenly that becomes a completely different set of social relations, even though the task itself is physically the exact same. So this is, I think, a better way to start trying to distinguish between reproduction and production is not as a spatial distinction and not even as an unwaged versus wage thing, but actually as a set of, sort of social relations that are sort of constantly changing, and the pandemic has changed a lot of that. The other big impact, I think, from the pandemic has been probably the most obvious one is the fact that all of this work has been pushed back on the home, particularly childcare. So there was a study that came out recently which looked at globally, it sort of drew up an estimate on some basic calculations of how much extra labor has been done in terms of childcare during the pandemic, just in 2020. And their calculation was that 672 billion hours of extra childcare had been taken up by households in 1 year. Now that's globally, but no matter what country you look at, most of that work has been picked up by women. There has been, from the evidence that I've seen, there has been a slightly more equal pickup of it than what existed prior to the pandemic in terms of gender balance, but most of it is still being done by women. So it ends up being anywhere from about 60 to 80% of that extra work caused by the pandemic has been done by women. Now that has all sorts of follow-on consequences as well. So in terms of women being able to keep doing their full-time jobs, many women have had to step out from the labor market. They've either had to go to part-time work or they've had to completely step out from the labor market, and that has a lot of knock-on effects as well. So I think there's a dramatic sort of impact of the pandemic, but I think the consequences in terms of gender balance, both in terms of who actually works, who stays at home, who sort of ideologically takes care of this work, I think a lot of that has been knocked back 10, 20, even 30 years in some cases.
Yeah, I think one of the points that I find really interesting that you've spoken about is that the left's concept of sort of a future is almost a rehashing of what's considered like the quote unquote golden age of capitalism, maybe like 1960s, 50s, post-war capitalism, which I think it's incredibly important to acknowledge how many people were excluded from the workforce in that. And I think that it's really interesting seeing how your writing talks about conceptualizing a future for work or in post-work and post-capitalism. And I was wondering how these sort of regressive trends of an extra burden of domestic labor and social reproductive labor has impacted your vision of how a future could construct constructed, particularly from a left's perspective?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think on one level, it's simply made the necessity of that sort of transformation more obvious, hopefully to a lot more people. The sort of the work that has been pushed back onto the home. So again, actually going back to the EndNote's piece on sort of thinking about social reproduction, one of their conclusions is also the fact that the state, various governments and states are pushing welfare back onto families. But when that work gets pushed back onto families, it's been sort of denaturalized in a way. So it becomes what they call the abject. And the idea being that, particularly in that sort of post-war period in the 1950s, 1960s, there was a massive ideological effort to construct the sort of, the male breadwinner and the female homemaker, wife staying at home, taking care of children, cooking, cleaning, all that stuff. There's a massive ideological effort to construct that as something that was natural, that was an expression of a labor of love, that had just been, it was almost a sort of genetic expression of the division between two sexes. That's disappeared nowadays. And even as this work is being pushed back onto women, I don't think it has that same sort of ideological justification and ideological hold that it once did. So I think it's felt much more as an imposition today than it possibly did in the 1950s. So I think there's a potential there for recognizing the need to change things. The other thing I would just add, and perhaps we can talk about this a bit more afterwards, but I think it also makes really clear the importance of taking into account gender as a category when we think about post-work. One of the arguments that Helen and I are doing are making in our book is that a lot of post-work thinking focuses on male work. It focuses on factory labor. It focuses on office work. It focuses on a lot of work which tends to be done by men, and thinks, well, that can be automated. But it doesn't really think about all the sort of unwaged work or the reproductive labor that socialist feminists have been talking about for ages now. So. And this goes actually to my own earlier work as well. I think there wasn't a sufficient recognition of the importance of taking that sort of stuff into account. One of the really interesting stats we found for our book is that when you look at what's called time use studies, so this is when researchers go out and they actually ask people to monitor, what are you doing every 10 minutes of the day, sort of thing. Mark it down in a diary and let's see what you're doing. And so you get to actually see, well, how much time are people spending in wage labor? How much time are people spending with leisure? And how much time are people spending on things like childcare, cooking, cleaning, social reproduction? And what you find when you start looking at this stuff on a sort of aggregate level is that about 40 to 45% of all of the work that we do in society is reproductive labor of some kind, unwaged reproductive labor. So I'm not even counting wage reproductive labor. And if you don't have that sort of gender sort of perspective in mind, that 40 to 45% of work goes completely unacknowledged in a lot of post-work thinking. So I think, the pandemic has put this stuff at the forefront of a lot of people's minds. I've got 2 young children, and my God, looking after 2 young children and trying to do 2 permanent full-time jobs at the same time is incredibly difficult. And I know, we are in a very fortunate position, and I know there's many others who are in a much worse position. But I think there's a real awareness now that something needs to be done about this. There's hopefully an appetite for some sort of future, a better future.
Yeah. So in your book, Inventing the Future, it focuses a lot on the Occupy movement as both a response to the financial market crash, but also sort of looking at the failures of it and how the left can pursue new routes for achieving legislative goals, social goals. And I think that, first of all, it's really crazy how frequently these recessions are coming. And I think that that's something we can talk about. But I also think it's interesting how the response, and this is in an American context, just because that's what I'm most familiar with, how the response changed from the Obama era response to the economic crisis to the Biden response. And I think that in previous lectures or writings, I've seen you talk about how there's not really a political appetite for economic stimulus. And now I think that that's actually something that has happened, and that it might have actually sort of garnered a appetite for more economic stimulus. And I was wondering if you feel like the changes between the response to the 2008 crisis and 2020 crisis have almost pushed these ideas a little bit further. And I think this also could tie into the sort of growing concept for a universal basic income, or UBI, and how that might turn and fit into this.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right about the difference between the response to the 2008 and 9 crisis and what's happened in the pandemic. I mean, on one level, they are sort of fundamentally different crises. One is, it starts in the housing market, it spreads to the financial system, and then it clogs up the entire global financial system. And that has all the knock-on effects on, businesses can't get funding, and they have to cut, cut investment and cut employees and things like that. And there is a real sense in which that is very directly and very clearly a failure of capitalism. Whereas with the pandemic, it has the appearance, at least, I don't think the reality, but it has the appearance of being an external sort of force which is imposed upon this sort of ostensibly closed capitalist system. Now, I don't think that's actually the case, because if you want to look at the origins of the pandemic, part of it has to do with the way in which we do industrial agriculture nowadays and things like that. So I think it's not actually external, but it has the appearance of it, and that's important because it's not then a failure of capitalism per se, but it's a response to an external issue. So this sort of, on one level, I think there's not as much compulsion by elites to try and bolster capitalism per se, but instead just to simply sort of temporarily repair things and then perhaps withdraw that afterwards. The other thing I would say, and I'm not an expert on US presidents by any means, but I do get the sense that Obama in many ways was, when he became president, he didn't have a long political career. He was a relative newcomer to the entire scene, and which meant that he didn't have people that he could massively trust within the system. He didn't have a whole team of experts that could necessarily simply come on board when he was elected and then respond to this sort of crisis. And so what he turned to when he was elected was the Democratic establishment. And the Democratic establishment then simply said what the Democratic establishment always says, which is, or at least what it's said for the last 20, 30 years now, which is neoliberalism. And that's why I think you get a very neoliberal response from Obama. With Biden, it's different because he's been a politician his entire life, effectively. He's been, I forget how many years he's been a politician now, but he has a massive network of people that he can draw upon. And from what I can gather, he's unexpectedly, to me, he's much more pragmatic, I would have thought. And he sort of recognizes that neoliberalism is dead. It died in 2008, but it's sort of been living on in zombie form ever since, with austerity and things like that. But with the pandemic, austerity simply doesn't cut it. And he's as a pragmatic sort of person, it seems like, he's responded to that in a way which is much more ideologically flexible than I would have expected when he was elected in the first place. I do think it's positive. We'll see what actually comes of a lot of his plans, given the need to sort of get it to pass through the legislative system. But yeah, it's interesting that the ideological shift has massively occurred, and people, for the moment at least, aren't simply saying we need austerity. I think one thing that's worth remembering, though, is that austerity didn't really kick in until like 3 or 4 years after the crisis. So it was save the banks, put all this money into the system. There were $1 trillion bailouts in 2008 and 9 as well. And then afterwards, it was like, oh, we spent too much money, we need to do austerity. So I think there is still the possibility of that happening. But it feels quite different, I think, from the earlier crisis.
Yeah, and I wonder, I feel like that the stimulus is really the closest that the UBI concept in some form has been really enacted. Do you feel that way? And do you feel like, I mean, I think that there's definitely there's an established criticism to like the Andrew Yang version of the UBI where you cut the welfare state. And I think that you've spoken about how that is a more right-wing approach to it. I do think to a certain extent, it did bring it to a national stage, just the concept of it, where a lot of people were not previously familiar with the concept. And then with the enactment of the stimulus check for every American making under a certain wage, do you think that that has pushed that conversation? I know previously you said, this was maybe a few years ago, maybe 10, 15 years. Do you think that that's maybe pushed it up a little bit more? Or push it to be a little bit closer of a goal or an idea?
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, yes. I think so. Particularly in the UK here, for instance, one of the debates that went on was about furlough. So the idea of basically companies maintaining employees on the books, but the government paying, I think it was 60% of their wages, and you know, quite a bit of the chunk of what they were earning. So there was furlough as a response to the pandemic, and then there was UBI proponents on the other side. And you know, I think the UBI proponents had a lot of good points on their side. One of the key issues in the pandemic was um, people who are self-employed, people who are freelancers, people who don't necessarily have that sort of full-time job. They simply didn't have access to that furlough scheme because they didn't have an employer that could put them onto furlough. And so you ended up with situations, particularly in the gig economy, where you know the choice for a lot of gig economy workers was go out and risk your lives delivering stuff to people in the middle of a pandemic, or starve because you have no money. And it was just an impossible choice for so many people during the pandemic. And UBI would have been a great response to that sort of problem. It would have simply solved it at a stroke. Um, Maybe it's different in the US, but in the UK, I didn't see a lot of take up of universal basic income as a potential solution. It was a quite marginal sort of set of voices which were pushing for it, even though I think it was a quite clear case for it. I think in the US is probably similar as well. I think the stimulus check, you know, is a sort of one-off thing. Um, Perhaps it showed some people what a UBI might be like, but at the same time, it wasn't. It wasn't really what a UBI is all about. You know, it wasn't eliminating your need to have to find a job. It wasn't eliminating your need for worrying about how you make mortgage payments, how you know pay for groceries the next week. All these sorts of issues which a UBI is designed, at least a leftist version is designed to eliminate. They still existed with the stimulus checks and with furlough here in the UK. So yeah, you know, I would like to be optimistic, but I'm a bit pessimistic about the UBI chances at the moment.
I see. I wanted to move on to discuss platforms a little bit more. So I just wanted to see if you could maybe give a broad overview of, I mean, you've written an entire book, Platform Capitalism. If you could just say a little bit about this shift to a platform economy, and then we can maybe base some questions on that.
Yeah, so I mean, the basic idea of my book, Platform Capitalism, is that there is this new sort of business model, the platform, which basically is it's not about sort of producing a good and then selling it to a consumer, but it's instead about intermediating between different groups. These can be, in the case of Facebook, it could be the users, advertisers, developers, companies, you know, all these different groups are brought together on the platform, and the platform intermediates between all of them. And that's where it manages to crucially capture a ton of data and then monetize that. But it also, you know, it can capture and control a lot of these different groups, which become dependent on that intermediation function. So my sort of thesis is basically that this new business model is very important. And the question is, well, why is it important? Why do all the most powerful and most valuable companies in the world. Why do they all have platforms now? Why are they fundamentally based around this business model? Yeah, that's sort of what the book is all about.
Thanks. So in continuing our discussion of the government's role in these different issues that we're discussing, I wanted to get your thoughts on how governments are interacting with or not interacting with platforms. And I think there's a few really sort of interesting examples that have come up more recently. Basically, I think Facebook, for as many times as it's been in front of Congress, Mark Zuckerberg, there really hasn't been much governmental oversight or really any sort of regulations affecting Facebook. And essentially, they're at a point now where, in order to make decisions, they're making like their own form of a governmental system, sort of an outside panel of people that I think come from different professions. And Facebook can either decide to take their advice or not take their advice, which is something I find kind of very interesting and almost a little comical. That in lieu of this, any sort of like actual governmental oversight, they're sort of making their own fictitious government in order to either listen to or not listen to. So that's one example. And then Apple, I know, and you can discuss this as well, is not a platform in a traditional sense, but it does have a lot of data, and there is an increasing cooperation between Apple, its how it holds its data and how it accesses its data, and in partnership with governments. For example, China, in which a lot of Apple's supply chain is situated, has now made it so that Apple has to keep Chinese data in China, which of course has many implications. America is doing a similar thing where there's governmental access to Apple's data. And then this is just something that just recently came up, but Airbnb, I saw, is now going to be offering homes to refugees from Afghanistan, which traditionally you would think that government would be taking on that role. But now we're seeing basically a company that essentially holds no real estate is sort of making this pledge. So there's a lot there, but I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on these sort of complicated times for considering how platforms are interacting with governments.
Yeah, it's yeah, as you say, it's very complicated. And I think a lot of it's very, very new at the moment. You have two sorts of different dimensions here. One is platforms themselves taking on sort of traditional governmental functions. And then on the other hand, you have governments sort of taking on increasing platform functions. So there's, for instance, on the latter hand, you've got sort of the digitalization of the welfare state, and people like Rosie Collington have written some really interesting pieces on this. But what is the impact of the digitalization of the welfare state? To one brief example, the massive surveillance expansion in terms of people who are receiving benefits. How does that impact the entire system? What are sort of the inequalities and power hierarchies that are being built into the system? And what are the sort of new forms of government control that are being built by the government taking on aspects of platforms? Then you've got, on the other hand, as you mentioned, platforms taking on these sort of governmental roles as well. Now, in Facebook's case, I think this is a very classic strategy from a business, which is that it recognizes that regulations are going to happen. The industry, as it has existed until now, is just simply not going to be able to survive unregulated anymore. This has happened in numerous other industries as well, whether it be automobile or finance or oil or any other industry. What companies do at that point, when they recognize the writing on the wall, is that they then try to self-regulate. And this is what Facebook is doing. They'll say, well, okay, we agree we need regulations, but we'll do it ourselves, sort of thing. And simply, by doing it themselves, they get to pick and choose what they regulate. There's been stories recently about how some of these reports about what Facebook is doing internally, they've been sort of modified, and sort of bad reports have been tucked away, and then good reports are released to the public. So there's a sort of manipulation of all of this stuff as well going on. And then I think it was just a few days ago where Facebook took out a bunch of ads in a bunch of newspapers around the US, basically saying, yeah, we need regulation. And then, sort of putting out their vision of what regulation means. So that's not any surprise. I think that's not unique to platforms. That's a traditional business tactic of trying to build your own regulations beforehand. It's a terrible idea, and the sense I get from Biden's, the appointment of Lena Khan, for instance, as head of the FTC, that, for instance, is a really good sign that he is taking this stuff seriously. There's been a couple of other political appointments as well, which all suggest that he's not just going to be satisfied with the self-regulation of Facebook by Facebook. So I think that's one aspect of it. And then there's the data localization issue which you mentioned. China wanting Apple's data on Chinese citizens to stay within China, and this is actually points to one of the sort of interesting tensions within the U.S. state. Actually, we oftentimes think about the state as having sort of a homogenous interest, whereas actually the state is driven by a series of different national interests. And people like Henry Farrell have been quite good on this. The way in which, for instance, platforms in the U.S., the Facebooks, the Googles, the Amazons, the Apples, they want free, unfettered access to data just transmitted around the world. They don't want data to be stuck in China. They don't want data to be stuck in any of these other countries that are doing data localization laws. And I should mention, it's not just China. There's a huge number of countries. Canada's been doing it for a long time with Canadian healthcare data. It's all over the place. But you have platforms which want that free flow of data. And then you've got the national security arm of the US state, which wants to monitor all that data. And what's effectively happened is that, particularly after the Snowden revelations, every other country in the world has said, well, we know if our data goes through the US or goes through any American-owned servers or data centers, that there's a risk that the US government is going to be spying on it. And in fact, they probably are spying on it. So every country in the world looked at the Snowden revelations and said, basically, we don't want that to happen. We're going to build a system which allows us to keep the data in our countries. Or, there's an example of Brazil and the EU building a transatlantic cable simply so that data doesn't travel through the US as it has been. So I think this is, it's where geopolitics mixes in with all of these other things. And then it also shows, the ways in which the interest of platform capitalists in the US are at odds, actually, with the interest of the national security wing of the US government. And I think that's an interesting tension, which is now playing out in all these sort of data localization things that are going on.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that you mentioned about just sort of capitalist businesses in general, more interested in self-regulation. But I also feel like Facebook's a very particular example of that. And I think that it's because of the tendency that you talk about for platforms to monopolize as almost like a natural part of it, where you discuss the network effect. I was wondering if you could just elaborate on that a little bit, to talk about why, how monopolies fit into essentially the concept of platform capitalism.
Yeah, so the traditional sort of idea of monopolies is that they emerge from things like economies of scale. So, for instance, as your company grows bigger and bigger and bigger, you're able to produce a good at a cheaper and cheaper and cheaper price. And that means as you get bigger, you can simply knock off any smaller competitors because they don't stand a chance at producing that good at that price point. So that's one sort of classic example of how a monopoly emerges. One of the interesting things about platforms is that their sort of monopolization aspects, they emerge from network effects, as you say. And network effects basically is the idea that the more people who are on a platform, the more valuable that platform becomes for everybody. A classic example is something like a telephone network. When there was only 2 telephones in the world, that telephone wasn't worth very much. It wasn't very valuable. You could call one person. But when 1 billion people or 7 billion people have telephones, suddenly that network becomes incredibly valuable because you can connect with anybody. Similarly with Facebook, many people disagree with what Facebook does, with the surveillance, with the heavy-handed advertising, with all these sorts of things that they do. If you're going to join a social media network, you'll probably join Facebook, unless you're a younger generation. You'll probably join Facebook simply because that's where all your friends and family already are. So that's sort of the power of network effects, is that despite all the sort of, sort of caution you might have about a company like Facebook, you still probably join just because that's where everybody is. So that leads to a monopolization tendency, because more and more people simply join on.
Yeah, I think this tendency comes up in Uber, or actually all of them, as you're saying. But I think Uber is a really interesting example that I wanted to highlight. So, for example, Uber has had just a devastating effect on the taxi industry, which I think that it could be argued that in some cases there is some sort of governmental oversight over some taxi industry. So, for example, the medallion system or something. So, while it is a privatized mode of transportation, there is some sort of relationship to government in that. And when Uber came in, it essentially just destroyed the taxi industry. But then the sort of pandemic hit and the supply of drivers just dramatically decreased. And now we're sort of starting seeing screenshots of, Uber prices being like $200, $150 for what would have been, maybe $10. And I was wondering this can how this tendency to sort of monopolize on it, sort of destroy the competitor, but then sort of have complete control over the market for something that's so important like mobility. I mean, particularly in Los Angeles, where public transit is very ineffective. I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about this, I guess, how this can progress or how this can move forward in this sort of impossible predicament.
Yeah. I mean, I'll pick up on your first point on the medallion system and its relationship to government regulation, which I think is actually something that often goes underappreciated when we talk about a company like Uber. One of the reasons why things like the medallion system were in place was to control the amount of cars that are on the road. So things like congestion, things like air pollution, things like traffic jams, all of this is impacted obviously by the number of cars that are on the road. And all the research on the impact of Uber is precisely that in whatever city they enter into, there's a massive increase in the amount of cars on the road, there's a massive increase in the amount of congestion, and there's a significant increase in the amount of air pollution in the air as well. So of course that has all these negative impacts on public health, and the government ends up paying for that sort of impact of the public in the end. So I think that's a really important point to keep in mind. And then you've got, what is the future of Uber and all of its sort of similar competitors, which I think is a really murky sort of future at the moment. Uber has been around for more than 10 years now, and it's never made a profit. It has routinely lost billions of dollars a year. It is, in many ways, a massive suck of money that just goes into this company and then goes out to subsidize rides effectively. Rides that we've been getting from companies like Uber have been significantly cheaper than what they actually should be. And instead that's been, investors pumping money into the system. And you may ask, how can a company last that long when it doesn't make a profit? And I think there's two aspects. One is not everybody who invests in Uber loses despite the company being unprofitable. And the people who were early investors, the people who were founders, and even many of the investors over the past few years, as the price of the company and the value of the company has gone up in investors' eyes, those people can then cash out and make a very pretty profit as a result. So lots of people have made lots of money by investing in Uber, even if others have been losing money. And the other aspect of why the company has been able to survive is by creating this mythology that it's going to be able to eventually monopolize the sector and be able to generate a profit. The self-driving cars was one of the more recent myths around Uber. And the idea being that if you invest in self-driving cars, eventually, in Marx's words, you'll be able to replace variable capital with constant capital, or workers, you'll be able to replace them with these machines. Now, that hasn't happened. Self-driving cars, as Elon Musk is learning, very difficult, it turns out, which, from what I can gather, if you talk to any expert about this 10 years ago, they would have told you that it wasn't going to happen just in a few years' time. But Uber invested a huge amount of money into it, and they eventually had to sell off their self-driving car wing because it was simply it was a money loser, and it didn't have any hope of turning around at any point. So what's happening with these companies now? As you say, the pandemic has it's been very good for them in many ways because their services have been needed in many, many ways. So things like Uber Eats and Deliveroo here in the UK, these food delivery services, they've shot up as restaurants have closed. And instead, restaurants are using these delivery services to get food to people. So those things have seen revenue skyrocket during the pandemic, and it's dipping back down now, but it's not, it's not going back to its pre-pandemic levels. On the other hand, as you say, a lot of people simply don't want to do that job anymore. It's a very risky job, particularly when you're carrying passengers around in the middle of a pandemic. It is a dangerous job. So you've got sort of a shortage of laborers in many places, and you've also got, workers organizing in many, many places as well to push back against the sort of constant cuts to wages that drivers were receiving. So I think you've got those two aspects. You've got shortage of labor, and you've got the remaining workers demanding more money, better working conditions, better labor rights, all these sorts of things, which is inevitably going to push up prices to what should be a more realistic level. Again, these things have been subsidized for so long. Where that leaves Uber is not really clear. One sort of scenario you can imagine is that its other competitors are going to be facing similar pressures because these are pressures on the entire industry, not just on one company. And so therefore all the prices will be going up. And therefore Uber can perhaps continue to survive simply by virtue of its size and its network effects, whereas its competitors might fall away. The other thing is that maybe investors will just eventually give up on it, like they did with things like WeWork, in which case, maybe Uber will just rapidly collapse at some point. And I think that's entirely a possibility. The prediction I made in platform capitalism was that there's two pathways essentially for these sharing economy companies. One was you go bankrupt. The other was you raise prices and become effectively a luxury service. And I think that's where a lot of these ride sharing companies are going, is raising prices, becoming more and more of a niche sort of thing rather than something you use every night when you're out at the pub or something like that. So I think there is a major shift going on there.
Yeah, there's also a few other platform companies that I think are almost a little confusing in their trajectory. I think two that really stand out would be Amazon, which you've noted that Amazon Web Services is really the most profitable, and Prime, or the delivery service, specifically Prime, loses money, which it sort of needs this free element in order to gain users on the platform. But something I've been seeing recently, which I feel like is almost crazy, is I've been seeing physical stores of Amazon opening up, like Amazon bookstores. So if you sort of look at the trajectory, it was sort of independent bookstores, then the sort of globalized bookstores, then bookstores are no longer a thing because of Amazon. And then now there's this sort of desire for this almost like public space of the bookstore. So now Amazon is sort of going into real estate markets and things, which just seems it's totally counterproductive to the idea of the platform. So that's one example. And then another example is basically the entire business model of Netflix, in which it essentially is this like liquid form that just constantly changes based on essentially the market. So kind of start out with the DVDs goes away. All right, we need to do the online streaming. All right, movie studios don't want to give us their studios. They want to make their own platforms. Okay, now we're a movie studio. And I mean, in some ways, going from in like maybe 20 years, DVD mail service to a movie studio, it's almost like it almost seems like a traditional form of capitalism in which you're owning the sort of like means of production, like the factory and the studio. Then it goes down to the supply chain, and it's almost like the theater would be the Netflix app or something like that. And there's something that almost feels like the platform idea is being pushed to its limit, where it's almost coming backwards a little bit. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I agree with it. I think in the case of Amazon, it's actually part of, I think, a larger story, which is the significance of logistics to contemporary capitalism. One of the core reasons why Amazon is interested in physical spaces is not as like a return to traditional retail. Instead, it's all about gaining physical space to get delivery centers closer to people. So the idea being that you can deliver to people much, much quicker, and then that is, the key sort of selling point for a lot of Amazon's e-commerce stuff. So I think, yeah, a lot of their purchasing of physical retail stores and the opening of these stores has more to do with logistics than anything else, and that's sort of the geography of logistics in many ways. And I say that's part of a larger story because you also have things like so-called ghost kitchens, which are basically just kitchens which people cook food in, and then they get Deliveroo or Uber Eats to deliver this food to people. And there's no seats there. There's oftentimes these things can be in shipping containers. It's a really sort of bare bones thing. But again, the idea is that it's all about logistics. You get geographically close to the people who are going to be purchasing this stuff, and you build up a network of systems to get that out. One of the most bizarre examples of this has come about in the pandemic as well, which is particularly here in London, and I imagine it's in a few other cities as well, but these apps which promise 10-minute deliveries of all the key sort of essential items you might need. Delivering 10 minutes is insane. But this is what these things are offering. And the way they're doing it is by, again, buying often in many cases, stores that have been priced out or lost money because of the pandemic and had to shut down, they're now being converted into dark warehouses for these apps, which then, you make an order on the app, a delivery guy grabs it and runs it to your place in 10 minutes. But again, I think a lot of our urban spaces are now being reconfigured around this geography of logistics and the reduction of, time in many ways. So that's a change which has been really accelerated by the pandemic, I think. And I'm not sure it's been fully acknowledged yet, how significant a lot of this stuff is, in part because as the ghost kitchen or the dark warehouse idea suggests, these things are often invisible. Unless you know where to look, you wouldn't even notice these things. So they're often invisible to the normal observer. So that's Amazon stuff, and I think the logistics stuff. And you're right that it is sort of a move away from traditional sort of platform business and towards a more, I would say, orthodox sort of logistics business in many ways. The other one is, what was the other example you gave now?
Oh,
I'm trying to remember. Yeah, Netflix. So yeah, Netflix and its move towards away from a sort of pure intermediation of a platform and in towards content production. And there was a famous quote back in 2015, I think, about Uber is the biggest taxi company in the world, but it doesn't own any taxis. Airbnb is the biggest hotel provider in the world, but it doesn't own any hotels. All of that's actually different now. Uber owns cars, Airbnb owns accommodations, and Netflix produces its own content, as does Facebook as well, actually. They just recently announced, I think, $1 billion creators fund to pay people to create content for Facebook. I think it's partly about power dynamics within these platform ecosystems. So the power dynamics about who controls content and who controls, particularly in something like a music industry or the movie industry, who owns the rights to this content, which is the big thing for Netflix. As they found out very quickly, you can't always buy those rights and you can't always control those rights. And you then have to, if you want to continue as a business, start creating your own. And they've done it in, I think, quite interesting ways. I mean, it's a very data-driven exercise from what I can gather, and it's a huge amount of flops. But also, they're putting out a ton of money into content that wouldn't otherwise be produced. But I think it is, it's partly why they've been changing is the dynamics of power within that particular industry, and particularly the way, as I say, IP rights interact with the platform's idea of like renting out content. That's that there's a tension there which is being still played out in the music industry, in video, and all sorts of other content industries. And Netflix just I think a month ago announced that they're going to get involved in games as well. So they're still sort of trying to expand and figure out what to do.
Yeah, something you've spoken about is the socialization of platforms, and I wanted to see how that thought process has developed. And I specifically actually wanted to ask you about Wikipedia, which I've actually I don't think I've ever heard you speak on, but it's a personal favorite place on the internet for me, and I think that it's a really interesting model in which that it is a nonprofit. It's not sort of necessarily under government control in a traditional sense, but there is, being deemed a nonprofit, there is up sort of like a public good. There is donation based. It's not for profit. There's no advertisements. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how, I mean, Amazon in some ways, like the services are really amazing and great, but it's the exploitation of the workers that is the really negative element of it. And I think that if there's more of a public input or a public control of it, maybe that would help help union workers be able to unionize and help improve the working conditions. So I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'll just mention Kathleen Thalen has done some really interesting work on the power of platforms, particularly Amazon. And one of her core arguments is that business power is traditionally operated through things like lobbying. It's operated through things like the threat of a capital strike. So if the government taxes us too much, we'll simply go invest somewhere else. But actually, what's happening with companies like Uber and Amazon is the mobilization of consumer power. So the conveniences that these services offer for consumers can often be quite immense. And when they get threatened by regulation, Uber in particular has been very explicit about this. They'll simply message all of their users on their app and say, oh, this government is trying to take away your favorite service. There's that mobilization of consumer power by these companies, which is, it's very interesting, but it also makes it incredibly difficult to think about, well, how do we take back some control over them? Because part of it actually means, as a consumer, if you use these services, you have to think about, well, how do you actually wean yourself off? Maybe you can't get same-day delivery. Maybe maybe you can't do 10-minute deliveries of goods without massive exploitation. And I think a lot of consumers aren't necessarily sort of ready to deal with that. Yeah, but then so on Wikipedia, yeah, you're right. I don't talk about it too much, but I do lecture about it to my students. And I have an entire week on peer production in my intro to the digital economy. And the reason why I find it quite interesting for that intro lecture is because in the 2000s, Wikipedia and peer production more broadly was, this really positive vision for what the future of the digital world was going to be. You had sort of this emergence of Web 2.0, the rise of the amateur, the rise of a sort of democratic system, and you had peer production, and Wikipedia was the prime example of it, which allowed this sort of decentralized coordination without any hierarchy and without any sort of price mechanism as you find in the market. And it allowed an encyclopedia which was available for free and seemingly of really good quality. I have a lot of skepticism about the quality of Wikipedia, particularly when you read sort of issues that you know well, and you're like, okay, actually, Wikipedia is not that great, but it still remains an immense resource for a lot of people. I think there's a lot of a lot of potential there, and I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from it. But I think the more interesting question, this is why I raised it in my intro lecture, is in the 2000s, people were saying, the most optimistic, and in many cases, utopian sort of ideas about what peer production was going to do. It was going to be an alternative to capitalism. It was going to be a completely different organizational form, which was more democratic, more free, more accountable, all these sorts of promises made about what this organizational form was going to do. Fast forward 10 years, though, and you've got an internet and a digital economy, which is incredibly centralized, more centralized than it's ever been. It's dominated by, in the entire world, 6 or 7 companies have a massive share. So, the idea of peer production seems to have failed. And for me, that's a really interesting question. I see if its organizational strength was so much that it was supposed to be beating capitalist firms and governmental bureaucracies and all these sorts of things. And for me, I think one of the real reasons why it ended up failing was, particularly in the work of Yochai Benkler, who was the major theorist of peer production and relied upon Wikipedia as an example a lot. When he talks about why this organizational form is so interesting, he refers to the work of Ronald Coase and transaction cost theory and things like that. And the idea from Ronald Coase is like, why does a company emerge? Why don't we just have markets everywhere if markets are so efficient? And Coase says, well, the reason why that doesn't exist is because actually sometimes it's more efficient and cheaper to bring things in-house into a company and develop a firm which grows in size to until it becomes cheaper to use the market. Benkler then says, well, yes, I agree on all of that, but this decentralized peer production is actually more efficient than the market and more efficient than the bureaucracy, and therefore it should take over all of these things. But his key sort of argument here relies upon a notion of efficiency and transaction costs, and mostly ignores power. And I think this is where the issues of, why does the centralization of platforms emerge when so many people were predicting the success of peer production? Well, it's because people who have power, people who have wealth, people who have control over key resources, they tend to continue to consolidate power around them. So platforms, in their incipient form in the mid-2000s, grew their power. They continued to grow larger and larger, and they very explicitly tried to, eliminate any sort of competition, whether it be a decentralized version or peer production version or a non-profit version. It was an issue of power, whether it be economic power, whether it be political power or social power or whatever. That was a key sort of aspect. So I think a lot of the reasons why peer production and Wikipedia, why they haven't been successful is that they didn't really take that stuff into account, which is where I find sort of a more Marxist account quite interesting, because it is class war, and class war can be quite vicious, and you need to be thinking about these sorts of things. Even if you agree that Wikipedia is an ideal organizational form, that sort of the virtues of it aren't sufficient to overcome the sort of impediments of power.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming today. It's been really interesting hearing you elaborate on these thoughts and hearing about the work you're doing.
Thank you for having me. It's been really interesting as well.
Great.
Yeah, great discussion. Thanks for joining us, Nick, and nice work, Seymour, on leading this discussion. I think that we're going to take another break before our next talk, and we will join you back here in about 5 minutes. So thanks for joining us. All right, everyone, welcome back to the DTP Show. Thanks for joining us today. This is a production of the students at the SCI-Arc Design Theory and Pedagogy program, class of 2021. Today, we're hearing from students and their invited guests on topics both central and tangential to their research and pedagogies. Our next conversation invites us to consider the implications of 3D digital scanning. Matthew Ridgway offers a provocative understanding of this method as a form of casting, which is often used in preservation and the construction industry to generate high-fidelity 3D representations of an existing site or building. His work engages in a derelict research field office in the mountains outside of LA, representing the site through a series of impressionistic digital and physical casts. It finds useful reference in the work of Jorge Otero Pilos, who uses physical latex casting to represent complex networks of environment and politics in his Politics of Dust series, as well as the digital scanning techniques and pedagogic tools in the Preservation Technology Lab at Columbia University GSAP. This conversation hopes to find the alignments and misalignments between digital and physical forms of casting, and will try to tease out what is peculiar to this medium of representation and research. Jorge Otero Pilos is a New York-based artist and preservationist, best known for making monumental casts of historically charged buildings. Otero Pilos draws from his formal training in architecture and preservation to create artworks that address themes of memory, history, transition, and invite the viewer to consider monuments as powerful agents for cultural connection, questioning, and understanding. He employs the material residues of our modernity, including airborne atmospheric dust, waterways, traces of sweat and body sounds, maps, and even embassy security fences to render their invisible meanings visible. Notably, he has used experimental preservation cleaning techniques designed to restore landmark buildings, as well as reenactment methodologies as part of his creative process. His site-specific series, The Ethics of Dust, is an ongoing decade-long investigation resulting from cleaning dust and residue of the pollution from monuments such as Doge's Palace in Venice, Westminster Hall and the Houses of Parliament in London, the US Old Mint in San Francisco, and Trajan's Column at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. He is the recipient of the 2021-22 American Academy in Rome Residency in Visual Arts, and he's also the director and professor of historic preservation at the Columbia University GSAP Preservation. He's a director and professor of historic preservation at Columbia University GSAP in New York. He studied architecture at Cornell University and earned a doctorate in architecture at MIT. Matthew Ridgway is a designer based in California. After practicing architecture in the Bay Area for 6 years, he entered the Design Theory and Pedagogy Master's Program at SCI-Arc. His work addresses the ways in which architects reconstitute sites through methods of representation. He graduated from Virginia Tech in 2014 with a Bachelor of Architecture and a Bachelor of Arts in Philosophy. So enough of me talking. I'll turn it over to Matthew now, who can get this discussion started.
Cool. Thanks, Matt. So yeah, I'm going to start with a brief presentation. Matt, if you could enable screen sharing. Casts are a unique sort of representation because they are formed by direct contact with the thing they are representing. This intimacy suggests a one-to-one replication, but a cast changes the thing cast. Differentiations of material and extent in the original are transformed into the continuous folds and contours of the cast material. 3D digital scanning performs a similar operation. Extended bodies and material are transformed into points in space. This first exploration takes this similarity literally, creating a scaled concrete cast of a scan of a stream. The second exploration engages a larger sense of sight in a correspondingly larger point cloud. Founded in 1933, the San Dimas Experimental Forest reserved 30 square miles in the Angeles National Forest for scientific research aimed at understanding and manipulating the hydrology of the San Gabriel Mountains outside of LA. Vast expenditures of labor and material constructed and maintained housing, research offices, and experimental apparatus, work that literally constructed the objective reality of the forest. In describing the site through the point cloud, something is lost and something is gained. Like a cast, the point cloud abstracts the place it represents. It does not pick up the history, politics, and meaning of the site. However, the point cloud does afford a new way of seeing the site. Where photos and measurement describe extended bodies, the point cloud describes a field of densities. This builds an impressionistic account of the site. The texture of what might be a tree or foliage or undergrowth slides forward or slips back. Silhouettes and regions of shadow are cast about, aberrant features of the spinning scanner. It's this work of reconstitution that I hope in part to address in our conversation today. To this end, I think it's helpful to put two aspects of your work, Jorge, on the table. First, the role of embodied meaning in your installation at the Lyndhurst Mansion, Watershed Moment. And secondly, the use of 3D scanning techniques at the Preservation Technology Lab at Columbia. Both could be understood as a form of casting, and both entail a sort of indexical fieldwork. I'm wondering, first of all, if you could address what each of these methods, latex casting on the one hand and 3D scanning on the other, offer as ways of interpreting a given site.
Well, thank you for the presentation, Matthew. It's really great to see the work that you've been doing. I'm already captivated by those what I'm going to call drawings, but are actually 3D scans. But I want to hear more about those. I mean, I think you pointed to something really important in the sense that, you know, point clouds, 3D scanning, you could say even casting, are modes of documentation. And casting was thought of as a mode of documentation for most of the 19th century. That's how it was presented. But very soon, people also realized that it did change the object, as you pointed out. And that's where I'm very interested in, you know, what are the kinds of changes? And at a certain point in the 21st century, latex started to be used, you know, and I became very interested. It was one of the first ones to start really using it. To pool to intentionally remove materials, to be very conscious about the fact that the casting process does remove some materials, and to kind of foreground that and to play with the process in that sense. So when you cast, you can set some sort of release agent or what have you to make sure that it doesn't stick, right? But you can do the opposite, and then you can pull the material. Well, the question is what you pull part of the object, or is it not part of the object? Is it intrinsic or extrinsic to the thing you're working with? And I think that's an interesting dialogue that begins to happen when you're casting something, is that tension between, is the cast part of the work, is the material that you're moving away, removing part of the work. So I'll just to put that out there, say that casting involves a material transfer. You're transferring material from one place to another, but it is one-to-one scale. And I think that what 3D scanning does is that it changes the scale. It has no scale. When it goes into the computer, you have to assign it scale. And that offers all sorts of really interesting possibilities to think about. How do you deal with very, very large scales? I think what I can see in your project is that you've moved from, you know, typically when you cast an object, you're casting something of, you know, like a sculpture or maybe a building. That's a big stretch. But who has cast a landscape? You know, that seems like a whole other order of scale. And And the 3D scanning certainly allows you to move in that direction. I appreciate the fact that you bring in watershed moment into this discussion, because you're right that it also deals with this problem of scale. In that project, the cast itself is casting the building, but what I was trying to do is to connect that building to the hinterland that it's connected to the waterways, to the watersheds of New York that feed it. That building sits on top of the Croton Aqueduct, which feeds New York City, or used to feed New York City in the 19th century. But it goes up the Hudson, it goes into the Erie Canal, all the way to the Great Lakes and to Niagara Falls. But of course, I couldn't cast in latex the whole of New York State, nor would I want to. So I made recourse to a different mode of recording, which was sound. I recorded the sound of water across all of New York State and was able to essentially make a kind of collage of the sound. And I was thinking about landscape. I was thinking about landscape and the way that we represent landscapes. And I was looking very closely at the Hudson River School of Painters, who did that magic trick, which is they take a huge landscape and they put it in a little canvas. And you have this amazing experience of this magnificent, sublime landscape, but you're really looking at 2 feet by 3 feet or what have you, right? So I think that in your 3D scanning work, I can, and I want to see more. I don't know if if you have more images that you could share with us, but I see a kind of leap from the strict documentary attempt of 3D scanning to move to another perceptual, let's say, level where you're trying to not just document, but also represent a large area. And there, I'm very interested in the mechanisms, the kind of the work that you do, the techniques, the methods to move from that documentation to that representation. Because in a way, the representation sometimes can offer more than the documentation in terms of understanding and meaning, and offering us a kind of entry point into those things that you said are missing from a documentation, the politics, the history, all these kinds of things. So I want to hear more a little bit about how you're taking this huge landscape and through 3D scanning are beginning to offer a representation rather than a documentation.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've really addressed precisely what the kind of the crux of my project is right now, and also the tension in it that I'm trying to work through. Because as you say, I have kind of moved from documentation to representation. And what I'm trying to work through now is whether this representation is at this point just a matter of aesthetics, which I think still has value in terms of it's enabling us to encounter the site in a new way. But what I'm kind of less certain about is whether this particular aesthetic or this particular method is sufficient to addressing some of the politics and meaning of the site. So the site is really fascinating because it was inaugurated by the WPA and CCC, and the entire reason for its existence was the both domestic and agricultural need for water in the greater LA area at that time. And so the entire project was an effort to understand and control water in the San Gabriel Mountains. And so there's this really interesting tension where the kind of scientific work, the kind of objective fact-making that happened on the site had a kind of scale of impact that was much greater than the site. But the actual work to construct that kind of metastructure was all happening through these embodied practices on the site. They were literally building experimental infrastructures, things that had never been built before, in an effort to study the hydrology there. And so, I mean, some of those themes and the tension between the kind of embodied practices on the site and their kind of meta consequences politically and environmentally are what I'm interested in engaging. But right now, I'm not totally confident that the kind of drawings I've constructed are up to that task, which is what is so interesting to me in the latex casts, because they are literally pulling off the kind of material, the dust, that is the subject of the kind of political and environmental networks that I think you're interested in. And so this is one thing I'm trying to understand in my own work is what is the point cloud pulling out, or is there a kind of methodology necessary to operate on the point cloud to make it pull out something?
Well, the 3D scanning itself is a digital process, and I think it's very interesting. For example, if you were to try to 3D scan water, right? I mean, if you were to try to monitor water with a 3D scanner, I can imagine, they had those 19th century photographs that took a very long time to expose. And when you see images, for example, of like New York Harbor, or actually even inside of this indoor pool where I did watershed moment, they took one of those pictures, and the water always seems like a flat surface. It kind of evened it out because it didn't register all the moving plane. So I think that there's something, and I think that when you 3D scan, for example, a tree, you end up with the same situation because the tree's not sitting still, the tree is moving. Now, typically people think of that as a mistake. It didn't register the tree because the 3D scanner is not fast enough to freeze frame. So you can also think of it as a gift, that things are not frozen, because you can see them, but you can still register them, and you can see them in motion. You can see their kind of extended presence in space rather than their kind of a slice of time, but you can see them kind of extended over time. So I think there's something to be explored with there in terms of the temporality of the capture, because so much of the work on a landscape, in a landscape painting or a landscape documentation, is to think about the question of time and long periods of time. And it's interesting, for example, that water is used often as a metaphor for time. Rivers, the flow of rivers, you can't step into the same river twice, etc. And it's this notion of flow that is part of that material, and so capturing that flow, I think, is something that will, if you can do it with 3D scanning, and I think you can, if you're intentional about it, then can actually begin to give you an understanding of the temporal aspects of this landscape, or how to access or tell the story of those temporal or those temporalities in that landscape. And they're material. They're different materials that are moving. There is the gravel moving over the landscape as the wind blows, and the water, the runoff. There is the wind, the trees are moving, the water is flowing. I think one thing about casting in relationship to this notion of movement and time and marking time and documenting time is that casting materials begin as liquids and then they solidify. So in a way, they offer us this analogy for the photograph as well, of the kind of freezing time, freezing a flow. And so you're seeing something almost suspended in time, something that stopped, because you're imagining this material continuing to flow. And so that's something quite special. You have it with concrete as well, though it's a little bit, you know, rougher and tougher, but latex has a different quality because it is organic. It's not a mineral, you know, a kind of inorganic material. So there could be a combination there of these aspects, you know, where you're actually casting something and scanning the casting as you go, and creating a kind of 3D modeling of that, let's say, pour. I'm now thinking of the work by Robert Smithson, which was this pour over a heap of land, and where he's just allowing you know, the material to pour over the earth, and then kind of capturing that. Yeah, but I think so. Anyway, going back to this question that you asked about embodied meaning, I think one of those questions to think about is the notion of temporality. And you talk, I mean, you mentioned it, the water was the reason why this became a study site, and water is the material at stake, let's say, politically and sociologically. This is what is being carved out or managed or redirected. So and water has the peculiarity of not wanting to sit still. You know, it just keeps moving around. So that's and it's also not very easy to scan because it's very reflective. But I think that in the errors of the 3D scanning, you might find an approach to representing it in a way that can offer us a view into it that makes meaning for us. I mean, I think that in a way is also the task that you're confronting, is to make meaning out of the situation through your spatialization of this material, through your documentation of the material, and through its rematerialization of water. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I agree that that's been the task for me. And I think the tension I'm encountering is a little bit the relationship between what I'm calling embodied meaning or meaning that's kind of in the thing itself that's made, and the kind of discourse that describes meaning. So one way I've been dealing with this work is I have these kind of drawings, and then I have all this discourse about history of the site and politics. And so I think something that was particularly interesting to me in reading about Watershed Moment was that, if I understand correctly, you explicitly requested that there be no or limited signage, interpretive signage, because of the kind of burden that placed on the perceptual encounter. Right. So I think this is kind of, I think that's how I'm kind of understanding this question of embodied meaning, and like, to what extent is the text necessary to bring meaning to an object or a work of art?
Yeah, it's interesting, yes, because I did struggle with that, of course, you know, as I think everyone does. I did request that there would be no interpretive materials kind of, you know, laid out on the site, and very little text. There was one photograph that I found that it was taped inside the building, and who knows when it was taped there, and it was a picture of the interior in 1915, and that somebody had taped it on the threshold of this ruin. Now, and so you could see the original, kind of look in and see this thing, you know, this stabilized ruin. So I had people, I had the National Trust. I said, let's put some, don't touch this sign on this so people can see that. But yeah, overall, I wanted people to come in and to be able to experience this place poetically and not politically, not only politically, because, this opened, pre-opened last year, it opened this year. It's been a very, 2020, the summer of 2020, when I made this work was, a very intense political run up to an election. We purposely closed Watershed Moment the day of the election. And then we reopened the following spring. In the meantime, we had an insurrection at the Capitol. We had, that summer there was all the social unrest around the country on various issues, including, racial injustice and environmental injustice. So it was a super heavy political moment. And what you realize with that is that you are forming your political opinion through the reporting of journalists, through the interpretation, through bits and pieces that people are giving you. And they're really kind of shaping your view of the world. And I think that's fine. That's part of the job of journalists, is to report on the world, to kind of give you that kind of in the moment political perspective. And there's an urgency to that I don't deny, but there is also an urgency to being able to take a step back and to look at where we are standing, and to kind of appreciate the place in which we are standing, and to kind of peel the layers off of our eyes, to just look at what it is that we are in. And actually, that's quite hard. It's actually quite hard, and so sometimes, in a strange way, you have to allow people the time to decompress, because everyone is in such a pressure cooker of information, that this, I wanted people to be able to go into a space and just have a kind of a moment, to look and think and feel the watershed, to feel the water around them. And of course, the difficulty is there was no water in that building. It used to be a pool building, but it's dry. You can't put water in there. And so I had to put the water in through sound. So it's a very dimly lit space, and you're listening to the sound of water dripping through from, Niagara Falls all the way to New York City. And it's just, you just get into a kind of, experience of time. You just, how much time is enough time to experience an artwork? Different people have different tolerance for being with an artwork. And so I wanted people to have enough time there. And so the lights are a little dim, and people could just hang out and listen and kind of look at this thing, and the light shift a little bit. And it just felt really important for people to be able to make that connection to that landscape, to that great immensity of a landscape, and the temporal immensity of it. I think that it's very, I think part of the reason why we have so much trouble with climate change is that people have a difficult time visualizing great big space and big time, and because our own existence is pretty short, comparatively. When we don't like to think of it that way. We like to think of, well, my existence is what matters. That's the the great measure of time is my lifespan. But of course, we know that that things have gone on before us and after us, and being able to put ourselves in relationship to those temporalities allows us to make different kinds of decisions. They might be political decisions, right? They might be other kinds of decisions, but I think to experience a place poetically allows you to then be able to step back and take and make different kinds of, let's say, political analyses, or and so it's not that you're let's say escaping the politics. It's that you're trying to recapture a deeper set of criteria for understanding what's going on today, and in relationship not just to kind of what people say, going back to text, you know, but actually with what people are doing. And it's a long way about to say that I've often found it, you know, very tricky, you know, because I see people, and I think we all do, right, saying certain things, but then doing exactly the opposite. And so I tend to value more what people do. I tend to think whatever they're saying, you know, is here, but when it really comes down to it, this is what they're doing. And so allowing people to just be in a space and do whatever they will do, right? It just kind of is, for me, a little bit more of the work that one can do as an artist or as even as an architect, you know, and allowing people to enact their relationship to this, to place, rather than to describe it, or to, you know, and to enact their entanglements and to see them, you know, for themselves, experience them for themselves. So also I would say, you know, this is just, you know, we're talking shop over here, but I think that there is a visual language. It's not as if a kind of aesthetic experience comes out of nowhere, right? When people experience something aesthetically, a work of art, a work of architecture, they are coming to it with enormous baggage, you know, of things they know already, and they're in their mind comparing and contrasting them to those other experiences. So that is very important, because that allows you to enter into a realm of existing meaning already as well, you know, to be part of that, and to play with that language and make new meaning out of it. So I think that that's also worth keeping in mind, that it's not that because you don't have text that you don't have any meaning. I mean, you can have a textual description of experience and aesthetic experience in which you articulate what those connections are. And that kind of, you know, what the Greeks called ekphrasis, you know, is important to narrate what you saw and what you experienced to other people who maybe will never go see the artwork. But if you go see it and if you experience it, then you get so much more. So I guess circling back to your project, to the work, you know, I'm just, you know, I'm still in my mind is that drawing that you showed us, which is quite compelling, because it is hard to tell what it is. You know, you can tell it's a kind of a landscape, but it's not quite clear. You know, there's a kind of a almost feels like a rubbing. It's not. It's, you know, that is. I think it matters, for example, where you show it, how big it is, what material it's made out of, because ultimately when you are showing a 3D scan, it has to be on some kind of support. It has to either be on a screen, on a piece of paper, so that to me would matter a lot, because then I would be able to say, oh, wow, it is a digital work, or no, it is a work on paper and it is, you know, 3 feet by 7 feet, and it reminds me of the work of, I don't know, Julie Meretu, you know, and it's fantastic, you know, markings on a page and spatial kind of vortices. And does that resonate in some way with what you've been doing? Or
Yes, absolutely. I've actually done some test prints on vellum. Performs quite well in that medium. Yeah, I think, and for me, it's interesting because the work has evolved, I think, and developed not with a kind of pre-intended sense of the meaning. It's been kind of rich with uncertainty, and in some ways I am discovering the meaning through the making, and I think printing it on vellum kind of revealed it in a different light. I think one of the tensions I'm kind of running into is dealing with this work as a kind of practice, or almost an art practice that I'm conducting, and the relationship of that practice to a pedagogy, which in some sense needs to justify itself. And often that justification comes laden with a kind of instrumentality, like, how do we use this to design? And sometimes also the kind of burden of the pedagogy has to be addressing kind of the politics of the situations you kind of laid out that we've encountered over the last few years. And so I think that, to a certain extent, is where some of this anxiety or tension comes up with me, is how does this kind of practice justify itself as a pedagogy?
yeah, so does it need to justify itself? I mean, I would ask, you know, or do you do justice to the pedagogy? I mean, who needs the justification? That's a question that I want to, you know, think a little bit about together, and maybe you can come back to it. Pedagogy, at the heart of it, is a way of transferring knowledge, you know, and it's an imperfect practice. I mean, there is no such a thing as a carbon copy of someone's brain into another person's brain, right? We don't have that. It's not like digital files. In fact, it has to be compelling and interesting for other people to actually take it up and to use that information in their own way. So I think that that's, let's say, also where meaning comes in. It has to be meaningful in some way, the information, for somebody to, you know, the pedagogy needs to deal with that ability to make meaning out of it, to understand it. But I think when you're dealing with aesthetics, and when you're dealing with aesthetic works, you're also dealing with works that are by nature open to multiple meanings. And I think we sometimes, the anxiety arises out of the recognition that you cannot control the meaning of the work. And the meaning doesn't come fully formed out of the artist or the architect or, you know, whoever's making this work, but that it also emerges out of the circumstances in which this work occurs. To give you a perfect example of this, I did a work at the British Parliament. It was a cast of the dust on the walls of of Westminster Hall, 1,000-year-old building. You know, we were collecting the dust, its history, the history of those walls. But as it turned out, the circumstances in which we presented this was that without any of our knowledge, we had no idea, the week that we had scheduled to present the work happened to be the work of the Brexit, the week of the Brexit vote. And so as we unfurled this project that we had been working on for 6 years, the whole world was coming unhinged around this project because of Brexit. And so it became associated with Brexit and took on the meaning of this, you know, cataclysmic event for you know, a swath of the British population, but also for Europe, I think, for the European project. So that you just cannot control. And the work, if it has certain qualities, can sustain that, you know, can sustain absorbing that meaning along the way. I think that's the best one can hope for. I think some other works, you know, don't have the circumstances of their life don't come right away. Some works, you know, kind of are discovered or made meaning of much later. Some works never have a kind of meaningful life, you know, and that's part of it. I think one cannot worry about it too much, but you can certainly, I think, do works that have sufficient layers to sustain that kind of interest. And so I think that's why I think the representation component of what you're doing is very important, but that it doesn't lose its you know, I think the tension between the documentation and the representation and the expressive dimension that you introduce into it is very important, because that tension is already two layers coexisting. That gives a great depth to a work, right? It's partly documentation, it's partly aesthetic, you know. If you can go either way. It can just be documentation and it can be interesting in its own way, but I think a work should be welcoming to, I mean, look, I don't know. I mean, I'm very interested in works that can be welcoming to people of various walks of lives, and that can enter and experience it without any prior knowledge of art history and architectural theory or what have you, you know, and just experience it for what it is. And the works can also sustain the scrutiny of those that are more, let's say, inside baseball. But if, you know, you can be all inside baseball, that's okay too, you know, because there's a contribution to be made there as well. And you can be all on the other side, you know, just of making works that are more kind of for a broad audience and so on. So there's a lot at stake, but I think you find your place somehow by trying it out. And this is where, I mean, I find that your work is, you know, within this framework of experimental preservation, because it is, in a sense, approaching the world from an ethic of care. You know, how do I care for the San Gabriel Mountains? What can I offer to take care of this place? And your work is always going to be in relationship to those mountains. It's going to be a way to try to care for that place. I think that's very important, and I think that, to me, that's what's like really interesting about your work, is that it starts from that ethic, and already that's a huge shift from, let's say, a traditional architectural approach to site, which is one of exploitation. It's like, how big a hole can we dig? Where can we get, you know, like take advantage of this place and put our thing here and you know, use it up. And so you're approaching this from the perspective of care, and your work doesn't necessarily need to be at the mountains, but it is always related to them. And that relationship, articulating that relationship clearly for people that are engaging in your work, so that they may also, let's say, participate in that act of care, seems very important, so that the work doesn't become completely detached from the mountains, and just become a kind of work for itself alone, you know. Right. And so that's a fine line to walk, because, you know, I don't know enough about your work to be able to really engage to what degree it is or isn't, or moving away too far or too little. It does, you know, that's for you to decide as you work through it. But I would say that would be one of my considerations if I were you, is to think about, you know, that relationship that you've already established to the mountains, you know, and as one of care, and then to ask, how can your project move forward as a in the service of the mountains?
Yeah, I think that's quite helpful, that ethic of care. And I think it's the project's relationship to the mountains is somewhat challenged by the possibility for replication of the methodology. So I can set the scanner up anywhere, and I can, within the point cloud, capture these arresting images or drawings of sites conceivably anywhere. And so it's like, one question is the fact that this particular scan happened in this particular site sufficient, or is there another step or another mode of approach that introduces kind of greater specificity, and it's belonging to that particular site?
Well, I suppose that, you know, the choice of where you scan is important, and, you know, because that choice of location already is one that is the circumstance. You start to create a circumstance. What am I actually looking at over here? So one of the things that I would ask, you know, in terms of that is, you know, if you're scanning, you know, one would assume that you're scanning, I'm going to call it the object. It's a landscape, but I'm going to call it an object just for kind of, you know, shorthand. The San Gabriel Mountains, there's a name. It refers to some kind of landscape, and presumably you're scanning that object, the San Gabriel Mountains. But it of course raises the question of, where does that object end? You know, and is that limit condition one that your scans take into account? Do your scans, are they placed, for example, at the place where the object ends? Do we map the end of this object? Where do the mountains end? Do you map always from the interior with the sense that there is a no ending somehow, that there, you know, this, so it becomes a kind of that's a very different kind of conception of an object, right? Or do you begin to map the places where things come in and things go out? You know, the kinds of things that are not of the mountains, as a way to map what's in and what's out. Because let's say one way of thinking about what's in and what's out is to map a periphery, but the other is to say, oh, I just encountered something inside that doesn't belong. And so to begin to ask those questions, and I think they're important questions because they go to real points of contention in, for example, nature conservation. Very often you go to a national park and there'll be a debate about removing a settler's cabin from the 19th century. That we have to remove it. This should be wild landscape. It doesn't belong here. Say, wait a minute, you know, if you remove it, you're creating a kind of false impression that this was a wild landscape when it wasn't. There was a logger that lived here for 50 years and was cutting the forest, and now it's second growth. So why not leave this thing? So there is this question about the human presence, whether that is or isn't foreign. You can also approach it from the point of view of materials. Where did the materials that were brought into the site come from? Or what were the materials that were brought out of the site? And there you begin to have a kind of a sense of the San Gabriel Mountains as not sitting still like the water, you know. The water is one thing that moves through them, and time is another thing that moves through them, but also maybe wood or, you know, different building materials, roads. There's all sorts of things that might be conditions where you can examine. Again, you don't have to vote, but you can just note, you know, the conditions that are there that raise questions about care. Are these objects that were brought onto the site or removed from the site ones that are caring or enhancing or moving forward, you know, through this ethic of care? You know, can we talk about it? Can we discuss it? Can your scans help us discuss it? You don't need to go all the way to say we are going to make a decision about whether to remove this logger's cabin or not, but you can begin to help establish this relationship. So you know, if you give yourself what to me seems very important, you know, this kind of framework of an ethic of care, that already sets up a kind of approach in which you can make decisions about where the scans happen, the relationship between them, and what it is that you're scanning, right? Because the problem with the scanner is that you just set it up, it goes, and it just 360, right? So you might begin to block the scanner. You know, you can you know, do different things to enter into the scan.
Yeah, I like this. That's really great. It's useful because the first scan that I did, that some of those drawings are from, is from within the mountains. It's basically situated at the hub of the infrastructure that the WPA and CCC installed. So as a site, it's interesting because there are all of these existing buildings But layered on top of that, most of the trees you're seeing are non-native. So most of the vegetation naturally is chaparral. But when the site was settled, all of these like evergreens and deciduous trees were planted as a way of kind of marking the site and settling it and also providing shade. So I think the work is already starting to anticipate that. And I think having this framework of care that you're describing, I can definitely see how that will help it kind of develop with a kind of precision. And I think also intervening in the actual process of scanning, I think is quite relevant, and I think something that is going to be really productive moving forward. Because I think so far I've been kind of letting the scan happen and then kind of dealing with the scan as an artifact I receive. And I think intervening in a more precise way in its creation, I think is going to be really productive.
Mm-hmm.
So I appreciate that.
Yeah, that would be so interesting. See how it is that you do that. What do you, and then presumably that intervention might also follow along various scans and be a different way of stitching them.
Right.
It might be the point of connection between different places.
Great. Yeah, this has been really great, Jorge. We're about out of time. I think it's a pretty good place to stop. Really appreciate the conversation. It's been great.
Sure. Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for sharing your work, and thank you for sharing all these ideas. Fantastic.
Thanks.
Yeah, it was a really interesting conversation. The two of you seem to be coming from similar but different places, and it's really cool to see the way your minds work together in real time. It's also interesting to hear you take it into the realm of care. So I know we have we have one more talk today, and that's also about care. So stick around. We'll take a few minutes here, and we'll be back with our final presentation between Andres Jaque and Valeria Ospital about care. So see you in a few minutes. Thanks. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the DTP Show. Thanks for joining us today. This is a production of the students of the SCI-Arc Design, Theory, and Pedagogy class of 2021. Today, we are hearing from students and their invited guests on topics both central and tangential to their research and pedagogies. Our final panel today is about architecture and care. As Maria Puig Della Casa states in her book, Matters of Care, Speculative Ethics in More Than Human Worlds, thinking and working with care is not only about making visible neglected activities and recognizing their potential to disrupt established hierarchies, but it's also about understanding their conflictive nature, the danger of commodification and becoming normative. This panel invites Andres Jaque and Valeria Ospital in conversation around multiple ways of making visible the political nature of design and the possibilities of projecting spaces of criticism. Andres Jaque is the founder of Office for Political Innovation and director of the Advanced Architectural Design Program at GSAP, Columbia University. He has also been a visiting professor at Princeton and the Cooper Union. Andres received his PhD and MArch in architecture from the ETSAM in Madrid. He has been an Alfred Topfer Stiftungstessenau stipendist and a Graham Foundation grantee. In 2018, he co-curated Manifesta 12 in Palermo, and he's the chief curator of the 13th Shanghai Biennale, Bodies of Water. His books include Superpowers of Scale, forgive me on this one, Mis y la Gata Niebla, Ensayos sobre Arquitectura y Cosmopolítica, More Than Human, Transmaterial Politics, Calculable, Phantom Mies as Rendered Society, Different Kinds of Water Pouring into a Swimming Pool, Dulces Arenas Cotidianas, Everyday Politics, and Melnikov, 1000 Auto Garage is in Paris, 1929. His research has been included in Perspecta, Log, Thresholds, and Volume. Valeria Ospital is an architect from Buenos Aires and a graduating student in the Design Theory and Pedagogy program at SCI-Arc. Her work explores the possible intersection of care practices and design methods. She views cleaning practices as an unconventional way of knowing which simultaneously enhance the relevance of the subject and exposes patterns of social relevance. Before entering the program, she taught for 3 years at the Universidad Torquato di Tella in Buenos Aires, and now collaborates with SCI-Arc's research department. So now that we have our esteemed guests introduced, I'm going to turn it over to Valeria, who can explain a bit about architecture and care.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Andres. It's a huge pleasure to have you here. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Valeria. Also, it's a pleasure for me.
Okay, let's start. So I've been thinking a lot about care this year. Care understood as all those things humans and non-humans do to maintain their world and live within a particular idea of as good as possible. And care understood as a performance with material implications. For example, cleaning a space includes the action of the caregiver and also a cleaning tool, a cleaning product, a reaction to textures, angles, moldings, and of course the caregiver's cultural idea of cleaning. So I've been interested not only in this relationship between an ethical position and its material performance, but particularly on thinking from care as a critical practice, on how a neglected activity allows producing alternative understandings that remain conflicted. And there are aspects of your work that seem to resonate a lot with this. Of course, on your project on the Barcelona Pavilion, but also making visible water purification, like in Cosmo, or in the Plasencia Home Gardens. So the first question is, are you interested in care, and do you think it relates to your way of working?
Yeah, I'm really happy to be here with you, Valeria, and I'm happy to be always part of any initiative that Matt makes possible and nurtures. And the question about care is really important because my impression is that we're in a different paradigm. We're moving, or kind of a paradigm that is growing from the cracks of the paradigm of exploitation. So we've been basically educated, probably all of us, in a paradigm that was very much thinking of humans as actors that would exploit non-humans and also fellow humans. And that was actually what architecture was based on, and many, many other things, like everything, basically, in our cultures. It's not the only culture, but it's definitely one that has been hegemonic in Western context. And but now we're seeing a different culture or paradigm, I would say, growing in the cracks of the kind of crisis exploitation took everything too. And that paradigm is probably the one of care. But I'm very happy that you refer to it, Valeria, as a kind of critical paradigm, not, let's say, a good one, or a kind of one of goodness, but rather the paradigm that we really need to unpack critically. And I love also the way, Matt, you introduce the work of Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, because I think matters of care, it's very much making possible to understand that care is highly problematic. Caring for someone, it's again a way of dealing with power. Who cares for whom? What are the dependencies that are created through care? What are the forms of emancipation that could emerge in those kinds of relationships? How do we deal with the fact that we're not individuals, but that we are infiltrating each other, and therefore care is not something that someone does on someone else, but basically it's the way the world is materially constituted, and care is not necessarily good. Care kills, and also care is selective. Caring for something means uncaring for others, and there's many questions that come with care that are making it highly problematic. So it's a paradigm that it's responding to many of the political challenges that we're facing, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge that it's not just, let's say, an ethical, let's say, alternative, but it's a new way of organizing and conceptualizing together the world that it's also requiring politics and require new forms of ethical scrutiny. And for me, that's kind of the beginning of a discussion. We're here, we're in the paradigm of care, but once we're here, many things have changed, but not everything is good here. We need, again, politics to navigate a world that is multiple, that is complex, that is problematic, and that is full of divisions and of differences.
Yeah. Yeah, I want to ask something related to that. So continuing with this idea of how thinking care as a relational practice, it's very conflicted. I've been working with cleaning practices, and if citing Maria Douglas, dirt is matter out of place. Cleaning would be redistributing that matter. So in a way, we could think that much of architecture is related to processes of social environmental purification, which tends to be nothing more than redistribution of certain material. So cleaning a space is constructing a relevance in a way that would inevitably affect another space. So in this way, it's also a practice that's at the same time connects very domestic environments with large-scale systems. So I'd like to ask a little bit about that. For example, I think in your work like Cosmo, this distribution after the dismantling or the possibility of monitoring the water progress from the up works simultaneously in different time and spatial scales. Probably you have many other projects that work from IKEA disobedience, from the impact of domestic. And what I'd like to ask is if in this kind of transscalarity that seems to travel that clean division between architecture and urbanism, together with many other clean divisions, I was wondering if you want to talk a little bit about what are the challenges of like designing and teaching across these like clean cut divisions.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because one of the difference that, you know, like often when we talk about care, it's really like, as you said, like it's often this kind of ethical approach to it that I totally respect. Is great, and we have to keep it. But of course, we move forward, and we then get to see many of the other sides, and we have to basically work with them. The first thing is that when you move from modernism, where that is based on the possibility of kind of impose system of reference, like the Euclidean or the, you know, like there's, but the care, it's really about how certain agents relate to others. Each agent lives in a different time and a different space scale. So if you think, for instance, of COVID, basically the relationship between a virus and a human, the way they are interacting or entangled, means basically that we are talking of forms of life that could have a very short time compared to the one of humans, but then that are basically put in relationship, for instance, through airplanes that have their own times, their own spaces, their own scales. That so there's no a single system of reference. What is the way that a human is seen by a virus or is perceived by a virus? You know, a human must be like a mountain for a virus, for instance, right? So we perceive mountains as they don't move. So probably virus see us as people that don't move, and then we expel and reject the earth. So it's impossible to see, for us to understand what a human is in the perception system of a virus. In the same way, we cannot see virus. We can see them through microscopes. So it was, as Latour explained, our entire society had to be reconstructed in order to see virus. So basically there's this relationship that we depend on. We live through that relationship of humans with the COVID virus, and that, but we don't share the same time, the same space, the same system of references, and therefore the question about interscalarity is crucial. Because basically we need to be, or transcalarity actually, I would say, we develop our relationships, our existence actually, through the transitioning from one system of reference to others, from one scale to others, from one time to other, from one materiality to other. And that transitioning, it's actually our permanent state. It's not that we will land someday in a space where all forms of life are operating in the same time, that mountains are equals than humans and we can have a conversation, right? It's not going to be that easy. So I think that modernity was putting mostly men, I would say, in the center, and they would organize in the world according to that man, which is an abstraction, of course. There was no one that was like that guy there in the Le Corbusier module or whatever. There was no one that was really fitting into that, but still that was a concept that was structuring everything. Now we're moving to a different way of constructing relationships, and that relationships are not imposed because it doesn't happen ever. So we have to understand that our infiltration on other forms of life and our being infiltrated by other forms of life requires us not to think in terms of Euclidean spaces, but rather on transscalar relationships. And that for me is a crucial transformation for architecture. And going, for instance, to the project of Cosmo, Cosmo was something like, give me a pipe and I will move the world. That was the second title for it, because basically New York is developing a relationship with distant territories, where basically the waste of New York is sent to places like Kentucky or Susquehanna Valley, for New York to remain this kind of progressively blue, clean, blue-skied city, and surrounded by, hopefully soon, swimmable waters. But that is part of a concept that basically means that those other materialities that are toxic for humans or incompatible with human healthy life are displaced somewhere else where there's other humans that coexist with them. I'm doing a work now with, for instance, Susquehanna Valley, and where the NOx from New York that was removed in the Bloomberg time through the clean heating project was basically removed and sent to Susquehanna Valley. So Cosmo was really a device that was intended to provide evidence that it's possible to coexist with toxicity, with that toxicity that is often sent to, or is not often, it's constantly being sent to Kentucky or to Pennsylvania, could be part of New York, and that would bring the opportunity to have multi-species urbanisms, in which basically humans would be together with fish, with algae, with fungi, with insects, with in a kind of a stinky coexistence that nevertheless could be very enjoyable. So I think urbanism is moving, hopefully. I mean, there's a kind of a dispute between this kind of blue-skied urbanism that is based on the idea of unequal territorial distribution of the cost of existence, or one that is really renegotiating and redefining the alliance between humans and others in a way that could be producing equality. And equality here in that project meant keeping the shit within, and humans kind of understanding that what could be toxic for them could be actually the habitat for other animals, and articulating those different habitats, the ones that could be catering to human needs, and then understanding that there's a cycle of habitats, that what becomes toxic is very relative and could be then passed to other species. That understanding could be much better, much more beautiful than one that is based on sending the waste of the waste for humans from Manhattan to places where less powerful or wealthy humans live.
Well, I find this very, very interesting, the way you describe this shift from of system of reference, from a modern system of reference to at least transoscalarity or multiple simultaneous interactions. And I was wondering, there are a lot of things that resonate with, well, the name of the project, give me a pipe, with give me a gun and I'll make the building move. And I was thinking, and you mentioned the Euclidean space. So I was thinking, how does this shift of references affect the way the methods we use, our designing tools? Do you think that acknowledging this architecture's capacity to reorganize collectives in a different way expands our language of representation or our design methods?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the name of the project was "Give Me a Pipe." Did I say gun?
No, you said pipe.
Okay, pipe. Yeah. Imagine
No.
me a gun, I will kill the world.
No.
Yeah, it's give me a pipe and I will move the world. But what your question is very important. Definitely representation. I'm doing now a studio at Columbia on architectural details. It's quite amazing. Details are done normally like black lines on white background, right? Like we take it for granted. I mean, it's quite amazing. I've been doing a collection of architectural construction details and plans, and they are all kind of the white background with the black line. It's like now if you go to Revit or to BIM, there's colors, but then they're not details in the way that I would understand them, because what I'm interested on is basically how details are articulating different existences, like the existence of, for instance, the obvious ones are the glass, the frame, the mullions, the silicon, and the flooring, and but those are the obvious. But of course, by doing that, they are saying there's an air here that is different to this air here. Like the interior air could be cool and kind of nice. The exterior could be whatever, because we have this super expensive glass in the middle that would make basically this thermal divide effective. We could have sun here and not on the other side, but then we'll have the carpet. The carpet will come right to this line, and like it's and if you go back and you go deeper, basically, okay, and this glass is produced out of silica that is extracted in Illinois, so that means that is kind of a map of Illinois, and also it's based on certain labor conditions. So it's people's salaries, it's part of the detail. When you do something that, I don't know, if you put some, there's certain kinds of glass that require to be, the silica to be extracted in particular places in India, for instance. And that means that India labor conditions become part of the detail, what is articulated. So my question is why architects accepted, why we accepted that the detail would be abstract. That's kind of a social convention. When we go to buy the fish at the market, we can read where the fish comes from, and that's kind of something that was added and added and added. So I think political action will result in the details progressively having much more and more and more and more information. So the assemblage, the material assemblage, it's also an assembly. And for me, that's it, from looking at the detail and thinking that that's an assemblage, and think of it as an assembly of with a political dimension where we really need to discuss, as for instance, who builds your architecture does, what are the labor conditions of those there, what are the conditions for extraction, what is the result of extracting silica in Illinois, as opposed to leaving the rocks, which are very amazing ecosystems. They have, all that should be part of the detailing. So when we see how architects in the past do details, construction details, we see how much is happening in our discipline. And I think that details will start to be very different, like the fish in the markets start to have much more information. And that information precisely will be informing of the transcolor dimension of the assemblies that architecture are. So the limits of architecture is no longer like the confined building, but the buildings, precisely because they're very concrete, they expand to different territories and natures and realities. This is not to undermine the objectuality of architecture. On the contrary, this is really understanding how important objectuality is. I love the physicality, the formality, the materiality of architecture. I'm not in favor of kind of immaterial architecture because, as you said at the beginning, basically any reality is composed by materiality. I'm actually claiming the importance to go back to a notion of architecture that is very compositional. But the compositional is not a way to claim that architecture is irrelevant or is disconnected, or no, on the contrary. When we look at the very materiality of architecture, there is where we can find its political dimension, its transcolor dimension, its connection with many different issues: ecology, regulations, geoterritorial tensions, labor, cultures of exploitation, inequality. I love to look at the details of architecture because in those material assemblages is where we, at this point, can find a big part of the political dimension, of the political performance of architecture.
I would like to ask a little bit more about all the research that's behind probably each of these details and of your work in general, particularly about the word ethnography. So I would be interested to ask you about this intersection between the idea of ethnography, which I believe might come from STS studies, and the architecture in your work, particularly on the multiple forms of conducting ethnography research to construct this understanding of the conflicted nature of an element. For example, at least for an outsider, the work in Phantom, Me as a Surrender Society, or a different kind of water spewing into a swimming pool, seem to have very different approaches, or at least different approaches. So I would like to ask this, do you think, well, there are multiple ethnographies, multiple ways of approaching an ethnography? if there is any particular interest between these variations of approach to geosocial context, and what is the role of the observant and the observed in the project? Let's see.
I really love architecture. Honestly, I think that this is very important to say because being such a conflicted discipline, the tools of architecture need to be given value. I think that the capacity of architecture to register, to scrutinize, to analyze the societal from a material perspective it's really a good response to many methodological challenges that our societies are facing. Um, when you were mentioning the work that my office and I have been doing on ethnography or kind of ethnographic work that we've done, it's true that it's very connected to the traditions of the STS, and that's how we started doing them, working together with people from the STS context. At the time that the actor network theory was first being kind of tested, and that there was an ethnography that was not that much about the spoken word, what people would say, or, but actually looking at entire settings of many different components, people, but also technologies, architecture, and trying to understand what they were building together, what kind of setting they were constructing together. And that ethnography was very different to, let's say, the ethnography of reconstructing a context to the spoken word. So in the two works that you mentioned, this was very important. It was very much about the giving symmetry to different entities that could initially be seen as very different. Like, for instance, the cat that lives in the basement of or that lived at that time in the basement of the Barcelona Pavilion, Niebla, was equal to us than, for instance, the salt that was placed in the ponds to prevent them from freezing. Those were, let's say, in the kind of terms of the actor network theory, they were kind of actors. But it was, we went beyond that because we started to see that they were not really that discrete, that they were constructing each other, and that basically the cat was also the salt, and the salt was also the cat. Actually, the cat was embodying the pavilion. She became blind by being in the basement. And basically, it's like the design of the pavilion was carried by her in the form of a physical transformation. At the same time, the pavilion was reshaped by the cat that was there, making it impossible that, or kind of removing from the assemblage the presence of or the participation of mice. And basically, she was constructing the pavilion as the pavilion was also constructing her. And that kind of messiness of mutual, let's say, exchanges or infiltrations was making even difficult to say where the pavilion started and where the cat started. Like they were really part of the same magma, let's say, of affections. And that is kind of much beyond the idea of the actor network theory that was kind of retaining the idea that the actors were both actors and network, but this was not even network. It was more like a magma of flows that were changing all the time. That was also the case with different kinds of water pouring into a swimming pool, with cases like some of them very well-known people in LA, like Harriet Gold, I think the CalArts trustee, that was, we reconstructed what is the kind of micro societies he was nurturing, or it was nurtured in the association of herself, the Sindler house, the garden that was where the flowers had been removed, and the traffic in LA, how all that was working together to produce sort of a very selected group of, let's say, different components that would capture power. And for me, the important here, the most important thing here is to understand that architecture is something that it's not space. I don't think architecture is like a box that provides kind of a neutral space for a society to come and step in. It's not like that. It's the societal, it's imbricating with the architectural. The architectural is the societal, and it's this kind of composition of very different things where the limits are not easy to, where there's not a CPAP possibility for an individual. It's what architecture is. And that is kind of a non-neoliberal notion of architecture that makes, in a way, architecture to be always a little bit dissident, because our structures of power are very much narrated as based on the notion of individual. So my impression is that these two projects are very are dissident in the way that are claiming that architecture is probably a knowledge that goes beyond our general cultures or our general political cultures.
Just a small question. I'm really curious, like, how do you approach dissidents? Because in IKEA disobedience it also happens. How because in the case of the Mies Pavilion, there is some kind of well, we all know the pavilion. It needs an alternative. Yes, or expanding our understanding of that pavilion. But in the other case, it's just by curiosity. How do you choose, or how do you get in contact with these dissidents or this alternative?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't think it's something that we do. It's more like I think it's a willingness to give power away, not to control things, and open the door for other things to be empowered. IKEA Disobedience was a project that was, for me, it's very, very important for me in my kind of personal education, self-education, or wherever collective with others. But I hate IKEA. I hate IKEA because basically you go everywhere and you find this same furniture, and but then I also have them. So that's where I hate it, because I hate them when I see other people having them, but then I go home and I have them as well. So I hate myself. So it's kind of a funny thing, but I think that's very much what hegemonies means, right? Like we're part of them. You cannot escape. So and then I started reading about IKEA, and many people hated IKEA. So I felt a little bit more released. And then I learned that it was at the time that I was doing this work, like the catalog of IKEA was published in more languages than the Bible, and in much larger numbers. So yeah, it was kind of a religion, right? And then, so when you look carefully to the catalog, the representation of domesticity is very weird. It's totally, I mean, I think it's changed now, but at that time, it was totally white, totally heterosexual, totally, of course, kind of middle class, wealthy people. I mean, everyone buys IKEA. No, you don't have to be white, straight, or wealthy to buy IKEA. But their representation of society is that. That's what the IKEA society is about. So, so I was very annoyed by that, and then I started to tell this to many people, and then in the office we started to do that, and many people were telling us about people that definitely were not part of the IKEA thing. So that is the way it started. Like we would say, okay, so let's just portray these people that are not IKEA advertisement people. And then we found amazing things. Like that's what happens with hegemonies. When you look at the margins, when you look at those dissidents, Not dissident, not necessarily needs to be like people claiming to be a dissident, but people that are just dissident by the way they do things, so they compose their living, you know. And then I found this woman that I was totally fascinated with. It's I still see her very often, Candela. Candela lives with her daughters, with her daughters' children, with cats, dogs, turtles, everything, in a beautiful house full of plants. And that was social housing. So she had like a rent control. She paid like something like 200 euros a month. Uh, and, uh, and but she had almost no money, literally, like nothing. So everyone was unemployed there, but you could go to their homes, and actually it was very comfortable. I think anyone would feel very comfortable at their place, and they seem to have everything. So I was very surprised, and basically she had developed an alternative economy, an economy that, I don't know, it seemed not to be capitalism, that basically she would cook for many people, and they would come and they would bring things, and they could do things for her. Like, for instance, they would take their grandchildren to school and walk their dogs. And yeah, she would be cooking there, but she would never buy the food. They would bring food. Like, I brought a few tomatoes, and I brought these potatoes, and I brought fish, and so she would cook it, and they would be there. But it was not an exchange. It was not that she was taking notes. Oh, you have to bring tomorrow milk or whatever. It was very, very organic. So I was fascinated with that. And then we did this IKEA disobedience thing. We photographed her. We prepared like showrooms, like IKEA showrooms, with her and with many other people that were IKEA disobedient. They were knowing each other, becoming friends. One day, there was a very conservative mayor in Madrid that decided to sell those social housing buildings. And Candela got this eviction letter. And it was very interesting because at that time, because the IKEA disobedience, we were very much insisting with the IKEA disobedience archive here and there. We were doing many, many things. Many people knew about the IKEA disobedience, and many people knew about Candela. Actually, Candela had been in the newspapers because of the IKEA disobedience. So when she got this eviction letter, a friend of her called us, and she was calling also other people, and we supported and we worked together with some non-profit organizations and kind of advocacy organizations. We organized demonstrations, and we supported and helped finding a lawyer for Candela, and not only for Candela, but many other people in the same situation. And eventually the eviction could be stopped. And many years later, I think this is like 15 years later now, Candela keeps living there at her place. So I'm very, it's not something that I did, let's say. That's what I meant. Like, it was really something very basic. Just open the door of those that were not IKEA obedience, being photographed, being advertised, being kind of explained and given space. But it was kind of a huge amount of people mobilized and kind of enjoying it, and developing affection links and bonds with people like Candela, but eventually had an effect. So I love that, because often people say, oh, but if you do things like that, they don't have any effect. But I think there's other forms of doing urbanism that they do have an effect. They do have an effect, but the effect comes in a weird way. But it's not a bad way that someone that could have been evicted, and many people together with her are still now living at the same place, paying the same kind of rent control, which is very, very needed, because Candela could not work at that point, and she didn't, I mean, she had a job, but she was paid very poorly, so she really required some help. It's not that she was a lazy person. It was like she was old, and she never got enough money to save, and the other people were unemployed. And it's just like there was these people that were in the margins of what society promotes, and they were great. They were producing so much. They were producing so much happiness to many people, stability, wealth. So they were doing many, many, many things, but in a way that was different. So I wonder if that's also a great potential of architecture to expand the spectrum of the possible and make it durable. Uh, and I think that that's also a very direct action of care. But as I said, it was difficult. We have to think of many things. How do we take a photograph of someone? How do we enroll someone in a project like that? How would we discuss with Candela? What would happen if Candela at one point would be disappointed with the press or kind of advertisement that she was getting? All these things were huge discussions that we had. But I'm very happy. I had a conversation with her very recently, and I don't know, this is already part of her life and her kind of ecosystem.
It's really, I really like to hear you like describe this. This kind of is not maybe the conventional idea of ethnography, but it's more like this producing of resonance of this organism of effect that you were describing, and the place that Candela has in it. And yeah, and that was, oh, I was also thinking, also going back to what you were mentioning about the materiality of architecture and the possibility of expanding the spectrum of the possible. In the case of Candela, did the apartment itself, or there was her, or the apartment she built, or the space she built, had any kind of quality would allow this kind of alternative way of living, apart from being rent stabilized?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good question, because all this was possible because of the apartment. The apartment was quite large. Actually, Candela, this is very weird, but Candela was married for a long time. Uh, uh, and she was living in a kind of small attic apartment, something like that. It's very in Spanish it's called guardilla. It's kind of a tiny apartment underneath the roof, so it's very hot. It's, a big part of the space is useless because the roof gets very close to the floor. At that time, she was married, and it's not that they were kind of super close, but she was. I mean, I had long interviews with her, and she was explaining that living in that place, she required to have a partner. Like, she was so vulnerable, and she felt that the daily life was so difficult in that place. She couldn't have friends coming over. Like, she was very alone. She had a partner. Then she was given the social housing, and they discovered that with the new house, they didn't have to live together. So for a while, they were living kind of not as a couple, let's say, in the same apartment, and then, but it was very large, so one would be in one part of the apartment, the other in the other. And then eventually he would leave the house, but because basically the apartment made that relationship no longer, the new apartment no longer needed, according to her. But then there was so much space. So she started to bring in other people. And then the house has a beautiful balcony. So plants came in. And then, and then the kitchen was quite large and sunny. And it was a little bit a mess, everything, but really beautiful. It was kind of more of a garden than of a hospital, I would say. So it was very lively, everything. But the distance made it very possible that there were many people doing different things, and that she could cook for many people, and then having them in the living room, having lunch or dinner. Those details of how the architecture was designed were totally part of the possibility of that network of relationships and or kind of ecosystem of things being relating to each other. And I think that was crucial. Even the furniture or many details I could tell you about the way the house was organized that were crucial to make this. In a way, the architecture was not different to anyone there, or each one was doing something to the others. both limiting what the others could do, but also empowering what they could do. I don't think there was a huge difference between the apartment and the cats. They both needed to be taken care of, and they both would give affection to the others. And that for me was, yeah, for me, that's a central idea. Actually, in terms of care, we care for the houses. My friend Jose Maria Torres was once wrote this thing of the house that he said it was a Tamagotchi. You remember Tamagotchi? You had to kind of this machine. You have to every kind of few hours you have to do something to care for the kind of technological device. Otherwise, they would die. So this friend wrote this Tamagotchi house manifesto. He said, yeah, my house is not for me to be comfortable. I have to take care of her all the time. Like if I don't water the plants, they die. If I don't close the windows, it becomes super hot, and then everything falls apart. And you know, like it's so I think. But then of course you get care also by the house, right? So it's kind of this exchange of affection, what defines architecture now.
I would like to ask also about the idea of intersectionality in research. Intersectionality understood as stating the own intersecting aspects, which might give a certain form to the project. So do you think that the architect's international intersectionality adds another layer to the political nature of the project, or that the project conditions of possibility are part of their politics, like the project's intersectionality? You know?
Yeah, I think the contribution of anti-racist activism and studies and thinkers, and it's been great. In the same way that I would say the queer activism and thinking, and the trans activism and thinking, and the ecology, I think something comes from outrage and kind of indignation. It produces knowledge, and I think there's so much to learn from anti-racism thinking, and Grisham, of course, was crucial in the development of the term intersectionality, that I think it's now an unavoidable political tool to understand how politics happen, and it's crucial for architecture because no reality is isolated. Everything happens in the intersection of many different facts. There's no absolute political agency in any entity. Political agency is always negotiated. It's always the composition of or the negotiation of the political agencies of many realities. That is crucial for me because at the time that I started working, and we started working with the Office for Political Innovation, claiming architecture to be political was very controversial. And also because we were not aligned to those that were doing political architecture. At the time that I started in 2000, with that we founded the Office for Political Innovation, if you claim to be political, that meant that you would never design, that you would basically do, let's say, statements or things like that, you know. But then if you were designing, you would have to claim that you were not political. You know, design is not political. Design is just, you know, design. You do formal things, beautiful things that are abstract. They don't refer to reality. So this is the kind of binarism that we were trying to confront. Like basically, no, we want to claim that design practices are political. That's the kind of politics that we're thinking about, not kind of because we claim that architecture architecture counts. So it's not that you do let's say a claim and then you try architecture to embody that claim, to be like a speaker. Okay, I want this, I want democracy, so architecture is democracy. You know, it's like you do an architecture. It's not like that. Architecture has its own ways of doing politics, and that's where I'm interested on. That's why I'm interested in architectural detailing, because that's where I believe architecture relates to ecology, to labor, to exploitation, to geopolitical tensions, to inequality. It's there. like in the Cosmo project. And that's where I'm interested. I'm interested on how architecture sends waste elsewhere through pipes. Those are the politics that I'm interested in. I don't want architect. I'm personally, I'm not interested in having like a building with a banner saying, I don't know, I want pure air, you know, something like that. I want to understand how the building operates early. That's my approach to it. I don't say that other approaches are not good, but basically that's the space that we wanted to. But then when you look at that, there's a second discussion that happened in the field of architecture. There were many people that were very disappointed, and they would claim architecture is not political because it's not it's not able to do absolute politics. Like if they were expecting architecture to be a dictator, you know, like, look, architecture was not able to do exactly, to impose something to others, you know, like, so it's not political. So that was kind of a second round that we went through of discussions and controversies. And there would be many people that would say, look, a building was doing this and now it's doing something else. So therefore it's like it was used or it was designed for a fascist regime, and now it's catering to democracy. Look, architecture is not political, it's neutral. And it's like, well, you're going too fast. Not really. Let's look in detail and see how architecture was defining possibilities, blocking others, making some more unlikely. And then the question of intersectionality emerged. Because what you see in those cases is that architecture never operates alone. It's always articulated to many other layers of reality. Architecture always operates in the intersection. It's intersectional in itself, intrinsically intersectional. It requires other forces to perform politically. Does it mean that architecture is not political? No, but it means that it's never absolute. It doesn't have an absolute power. It's always a capacity to instigate, to make things more likely, to make them less likely, but always something that is negotiated with other forms of power. And for me, that's crucial, because then the question is not whether architecture is political, but how do we relate to architecture politically? How do we relate to a building in a way that we understand that there's certain things that that building is doing politically, and we can add others, we can manage others, we can. When we saw when we studied the Barcelona Pavilion, we could understand that the project by Mies van der Rohe and Lily Reich and others was actually very fragile. It was very easy to reprogram. For instance, the building was supposed to be a passing point, like you could go to the building to go to the Pueblo Andaluz that was above, right? But then they put some gardening behind it, and it was no longer possible to cross it. That was done because they wanted to sell tickets. So it was very difficult to sell the tickets if you had a place, if you could cross it easily, you know. So they had only one person watching that you had a ticket. So they basically put some bushes at the back, so no one could leave from there, and that would make it easier to control the ticket and selling the tickets. Only one person doing that. But it's never been like that. Like there's some agency that keeps happening, that keeps being embedded in the materiality of the building. And for instance, cats move freely through the pavilion. It's so beautiful to see how the cats are now the kind of the ones that are enjoying the Miesian architectural idea. Or for instance, many people break in the pavilion at night to do cruising in the pavilion. So cruisers and cats are part of the Miesian kind of circulations, and many other things that I could tell you. So the power of Mies is not absolute. He wanted, or they wanted, the building to be a crossing point. And it's no longer like that because it's intersecting with other structures of power, and that's reprogramming a big part of it. But it's still there. It's a negotiation, and I'm sure that at one point they will cut the bushes and they will get people go through, and that intersectionality is also very important when we look at the way architecture is often happening in the intersection of, for instance, toxicity management, aesthetics of exclusion, environmental distribution, but also kind of voting systems, taxing systems. When I was narrating before the work that we're doing on ultra clear glass and looking at the way Susquehanna Valley and Illinois, and we see that the Bloomberg design of the clean heat, the clean heat project to turn the sky blue in New York intersects with the real estate market, and then also with the detailing of windows in 432, and all these kind of layers of design work together to produce a reality. The problem is that we architects need to engage on research if we want to understand how all these layers of design work together in the creation of a basically political context. It's very difficult to connect the links of the layers and to understand that the political outcome is the result of Bloomberg banning the use of oil in boilers in New York, that intersecting with tax reductions, exceptions for billionaires to bring their money, that intersecting with legal design that allowed LLCs to be used to hide the ownership of apartments in New York, that intersecting with the design of 432 and other apartment buildings, high-end apartment buildings, that intersecting with the possibility of allowing fracking in Susquehanna. And when you put all these layers of design together, you get the political context, which is the result of design. But one layer it's not that you can, the political outcome or contribution of each of the layers is impossible to understand without understanding how they all intersect together. That's why I think understanding the intersectionality of design now means also that design practices require to engage on research. We need to take much more effort. We have to do many more efforts to do our site plan in a way. Our site plan needs to be kind of constructing all these layers, and that makes design at this point a practice that also requires this research. But I mean, that's not different to what doctors have gone through, right? Like when you go to the doctor, there's so much research that is done. I don't know, the other day I went to the doctor and a few hours later, I started in the Mount Sinai app, I started to receive all these test, you know, so all these layers again. So I think that architects now, it's like that, right?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I really like how you describe it, and this difference between maybe an already old understanding of politics as a manifesto and an absolute, shifting to understand politics as a way of relating, and these layers, which actually like make architecture in a way. So I think we're running out of time. Are we not? Or are we okay? But it was an enormous pleasure talking to you, and thank you very much for this beautiful conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Valeria. That was a great conversation. Thank you for leading that. And it's always great to hear about your latest thoughts on things, Andres. And I know it relates very closely to some of the things Valeria's been talking about this semester and studying. So it's really nice to hear the two of you kind of discuss that.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed so much the conversation, and happy to be part of this series that you're doing.
Yeah, great to have you. So that does it for the DTP Show 2021. It's been a great series of talks. I want to thank Valeria and Andres, as well as our other speakers, Mark Foster Gage, Carlos Sturkin, Finian McManus, James Chen, Marcelin Gao, Reza Salehi, Nick Cernacek, Seymour Politan, Jorge Otero Pilos, and Matthew Ridgway. And thank you to SCI-Arc for letting us put this on, and thanks to all of our viewers for watching. So until next year, that's the DTP Show.